Music. What did Governor Abbott miss that could turn 5 newly created GOP districts into a long-term political disaster? Because when Jasmine Crockett reacted to the Supreme Court's decision allowing Texas to move forward with its controversial redistricting plan, she didn't just disagree. She delivered a warning that has many Republicans quietly uneasy behind closed doors. Before we get into why Jasmine Crockett's response to being pushed out by a redrawn map could become the worst outcome imaginable for Texas Republicans, make sure you subscribe. This story shows how a ruling that looked like a win for the GOP might actually set the stage for a massive strategic mistake. The news dropped early Friday morning, a political shockwave that instantly took over headlines, talk shows, and every major social media platform. The Supreme Court ruled that Texas could use its newly approved voting maps for the 2026 midterm elections. These were the same maps a federal panel had already determined were discriminatory. The same maps that weakened minority voting power across several districts. The same maps that essentially erased Jasmine Crockett's current district. Governor Greg Abbott responded quickly, celebrating the ruling as a major victory. He declared that Texas had become even more solidly Republican. He called it a win for Texas voters for common sense and for the U.S. Constitution. Within minutes, right-wing media outlets cheered, and Twitter lit up with GOP supporters taking a victory lap. Commenters bragged that Democrats had been outsmarted, that Texas would stay red for years, and that progressive voices had been legally sidelined. Some attacks got personal, mocking Crockett directly with insults like, "She's done fired by the map, and Texas never wanted her anyway." It was political gloating at its purest, the kind that erupts when one side believes they've landed a final knockout punch, but then Jasmine Crockett responded. And what she said wasn't defensive, emotional, or defeated. It was the kind of statement that makes political strategists pause, pull out their notebooks, and rethink their predictions. Her first post went up calmly, almost surgical in tone, as if she saw this coming and already had her strategy in place. She wrote that while the Supreme Court's decision was disappointing, it wasn't surprising given what she described as a MAGA-influenced court. Then she laid out her key point. Texans were being required to vote under maps that 3 federal judges in Texas had already concluded diluted the voices of Black, Latino, and other minority communities. She reminded everyone that those findings still stand. The Supreme Court didn't overturn them, it simply allowed the maps to be used temporarily for the 2026 election while the legal fight continues. That framing mattered. She wasn't treating the decision as a final judgment on whether the maps were constitutional. She reframed the ruling as nothing more than a procedural pause. Her message was simple. Republicans weren't celebrating a clean win. They were celebrating the ability to use maps that judges had already labeled discriminatory while the appeals process drags on, she continued. And her tone moved from explaining the legal situation to issuing a direct challenge. She made it unmistakably clear the Supreme Court did not declare these maps fair. They did not rule that the maps were constitutional. They did not overturn what the lower court previously decided. All the Supreme Court did was allow maps that a federal panel had already labeled discriminatory to remain in place, temporarily. Line by line, she took apart the Republican narrative of a major victory. They hadn't won the debate, they had simply secured extra time for maps that were still under serious legal scrutiny. It was the difference between saying, "Our maps were proven lawful, and we convinced the court to let us use them while others continue proving they may be unlawful." Crockett highlighted that distinction, making sure the public understood exactly what had happened. Then came the warning that quickly became the most talked about part of her entire response. The moment her statement shifted from defensive to offensive, she addressed every politician celebrating the ruling with a message that cut straight to the point. Don't get too comfortable. These maps, she said, were drawn like political Russian roulette, splitting communities, tightening margins, and assuming voters would simply accept it. When mapmakers push district lines this far, they risk losing the seats they believe they've secured. The phrase political Russian roulette was calculated and sharp. She wasn't only saying the maps targeted minority voters. She was suggesting that Republicans had gone so far in trying to engineer guaranteed wins that they might have created their own weaknesses in districts they assumed were untouchable. It was both a prediction and a warning wrapped into a single metaphor. She backed up her point with fresh, real-world evidence. "We've seen this happen already," she said. "Look at Tennessee. That race got extremely close. When a supposedly safe Republican district drops to a single-digit margin, nothing is guaranteed anymore." The reference to Tennessee was no accident. Republicans there had also redrawn the lines aggressively, confident they had locked down their dominance. But in the special election that followed, a district that had long been solidly Republican nearly flipped. The margin fell below 5 points. It served as confirmation for Crockett's argument. Extreme gerrymandering can backfire when it energizes the very communities it was meant to suppress. Her follow-up message built on that theme and added a new layer. Even Texas Republicans, she said, were stepping away from the 2026 elections. They saw the danger ahead. They understood the possibility that these maps could become a political trap for their own party. This detail hadn't been widely reported yet, but she made it public. Some GOP incumbents in Texas were quietly choosing not to run for re-election. Maybe it was coincidence retirements are normal, but the timing pointed to a different explanation. Experienced lawmakers were looking at the newly redrawn maps and deciding they didn't want to risk losing in districts that were supposed to be reliably safe. Republicans themselves weren't fully confident in these new maps. Why should anyone accept Abbott's victory claims at face value? Crockett wrapped up her message with a conclusion that blended defiance, strategic clarity, and a direct challenge to the power structure that assumed it had pushed her out. She warned that if Republicans believed these maps guaranteed permanent control, they were in for a rude awakening. The final decision, she said, would not come from Donald Trump, Greg Abbott, or a Supreme Court willing to overlook the lower court's findings. The final decision would come from the people of Texas, and when Texans cast their votes, she promised, the results would make the truth clear. The reaction to her thread was immediate and split. Straight down predictable political lines. Conservatives mocked her, calling her a sore loser who refused to accept reality. But that surface-level dismissal overlooked something much more important happening simultaneously. Her posts were spreading rapidly, especially among Black and Latino voters who felt recognized, heard, and validated. These communities weren't discouraged, they were fired up. Instead of accepting defeat, they embraced her refusal to treat the ruling as the end of the story. Support poured in by the thousands. People replied with messages like, "We're with you, Jasmine. Keep pushing," and "Voters hold the real power." The emotional energy behind the responses was unmistakable. This wasn't just another political reaction. It had become a rallying cry that reached directly into the same communities the redistricting had attempted to weaken behind the scenes. According to individuals familiar with Democratic discussions, Crockett's response triggered conversations no one expected. If the map effectively erased her House district, that didn't necessarily end her political career. It might open the door to something bigger. Instead of being boxed out, what stopped her from running statewide? What stopped her from using the national recognition she'd built to go after a Senate seat or another statewide office where gerrymandering couldn't limit her influence? Those questions didn't feel theoretical. They suddenly felt realistic. Political analysts began studying the maps Crockett indirectly pointed to in her comments. Yes, the new lines gave Republicans what they believed were 5 additional safe GOP seats. But to create those seats, they had to stretch their voter base thinner across the state, reducing margins in districts that had once been firmly Republican. They gained new, safe seats by making others less secure. It was a classic zero-sum calculation. A political science professor at the University of Texas, reviewing the maps after Crockett's statements, summed it up clearly. What Representative Crockett pointed out is the inherent risk in extreme partisan gerrymandering. You can manufacture more safe seats on paper, but when you shrink your margins everywhere else, you become exposed to wave elections or strong turnout. From the opposing party, the 2018 midterms had already demonstrated this pattern in several states. Gerrymandered maps that once looked unbeatable suddenly cracked in multiple states the moment voter enthusiasm rose higher than the assumptions used to design those districts. And for Republicans, Crockett's warning about Tennessee wasn't an isolated outlier. In Wisconsin, years of aggressive GOP gerrymandering produced districts that flipped the moment Democratic turnout surged. In North Carolina, seats that had been considered rock solid for Republicans became competitive as soon as courts required maps that were even slightly less partisan. The trend was undeniable. The more aggressively a map was engineered, the more fragile it became when political conditions shifted, and Crockett wasn't just describing that pattern, she was openly promising to create those conditions herself. Her posts weren't casual reactions. They were a public commitment that she and the voters she represents would refuse to view these maps as legitimate, would refuse to treat them as permanent, and would work relentlessly to expose how vulnerable those districts truly were. When a political figure with her national audience and her ability to mobilize voters makes that kind of pledge, it becomes a force of its own. She would raise money, organize volunteers, and campaign specifically to prove that even the most gerrymandered lines could be beaten, and Republicans would now be forced to defend seats they assumed were safe seats they believed had been secured through the redistricting process. Greg Abbott's confident proclamation, "Texas is officially and legally more red," began to look less like a victory statement and more like a premature celebration. Several Republican strategists, speaking privately because they didn't want to contradict the governor in public, told reporters they were worried Abbott's tone was creating dangerous overconfidence among GOP voters while energizing Democrats. "When you declare the election already won," one consultant said, "your own supporters may think their turnout doesn't matter, while your opponents see your words as a challenge." Another strategist put it more bluntly. Crockett just handed Democrats a narrative. These maps are illegitimate, temporary, and beatable. That message motivates people. It's way more energizing than "we lost and there's nothing to be done." The difference between Abbott's victory lap and Crockett's strategic pushback highlighted two totally different responses to political obstacles. Abbott treated the Supreme Court's procedural ruling as a done deal, as if the entire issue had been settled. Crockett treated it like a hurdle one she fully intended to overcome by rallying the voters who felt targeted by the maps. Abbott relied on the map to determine the outcome. Crockett insisted voters could override the map entirely. In the days after her messages went viral, tangible signs showed her message was spreading far beyond her base. Voter registration groups in Texas reported noticeable increases in sign-ups, especially among younger voters and communities of color. Democratic donors began shifting money into Texas races long seen as unwinnable. And perhaps the clearest indicator of all, several Republican incumbents in newly redrawn districts started releasing ads emphasizing their independence and local focus, the kind of messaging used by candidates who fear a competitive race, not politicians who feel secure in a safe district. A Democratic strategist familiar with Texas politics summed it up this way: Jasmine managed to turn what looked like a loss into a mission. Instead of acting defeated after being redrawn out of her district, she reframed it as proof that Republicans were afraid of her influence and the voters she represents. And she assured those voters that they had the power to prove the maps wrong. That kind of framing is incredibly powerful. It takes what could have been a discouraging moment and turns it into motivation. The real question left, intentionally unanswered by Crockett, was what she planned to do next. Her district, at least in its current form, might disappear in 2026, but that didn't mean her political future was over. It could mean her career was about to expand far beyond the borders of a single House seat. Statewide elections aren't shaped by gerrymandering the way congressional districts are. You can't redraw an entire state to dilute voters. If Crockett chose to run for Senate or another statewide position, she'd compete on a playing field where the redistricting strategies used by Republicans wouldn't shield them. That possibility, the idea that being pushed out of a House district could propel her into a race where she posed an even bigger threat to Republican control was the subtext political insiders immediately picked up on. She wasn't only warning Republicans about House races in 2026, she was hinting that their attempt to sideline her could backfire by inspiring her to pursue a higher office. In her final message within the thread, Crockett emphasized the principle that elevated her response beyond simple political messaging. She declared that the final say belongs to the people of Texas. It was a statement rooted in democratic belief, a contrast to the cynicism of gerrymandering and the frustration many felt after the Supreme Court's decision. Politicians could redraw maps, courts could issue rulings, governors could celebrate, but in the end, voters would determine the outcome. And if enough Texans rejected maps created to weaken their voices, those maps could fail despite being legally allowed. For Greg Abbott, celebrating what he believed was a decisive win while Jasmine Crockett publicly vowed to prove him wrong. The coming months would reveal whether he had secured a long-term advantage or accidentally triggered a much larger challenge. As Crockett warned, when you design maps like political Russian roulette, eventually the loaded chamber comes up and early signs suggested that the political fallout might land squarely in the districts Republicans assumed were safely protected. If this breakdown showed how Jasmine Crockett turned a redistricting setback into a powerful call for voter mobilization, demonstrated why declaring victory too soon can explode back on you. Make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the political moments where setbacks transform into new momentum. Drop a comment telling us whether you think extreme gerrymandering ultimately helps or harms the party that draws the lines. And share this with anyone who needs the reminder that maps don't vote. People do. Your engagement helps us continue covering stories about how democracy pushes back against those who try to rig the outcome.